pleased to be hosting Doug McKenna, George Mason University's Registrar, on today's podcast. Doug, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure thing. Thanks for having me, Karen. It's great to be here. I'm Doug McKenna. I'm the University Registrar at George Mason University, as you said. The main campus is in Fairfax, Virginia. We have a couple of other campuses in Prince William County, in Arlington, and then one in Songdo, Korea as well. We're the largest and most diverse public institution in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I have been at Mason for a little over 5 years now. I arrived about 8 months before the pandemic hit, which was a nice time for me to get there and meet everybody before I sent everybody home for 2 weeks to flatten the curve. My higher education career has spanned over 20 years now. I've worked in registrar's offices at 5 different institutions, starting at the University of Notre Dame, Michigan State University, George Washington University. Then I became the registrar at American University, and now the University Registrar at George Mason. Prior to higher education, I had a brief stint with IBM after I graduated from college. So about 4 years working with international business machines. And I picked up a bunch of things in that brief amount of time that have helped me through my higher ed career as well. I'm currently an all but dissertation doctoral student in education, and hopefully will finish up my PhD next year, sometime in 2026. We'll see. I live in Virginia. I have a wife and 2 kids and 2 dogs, and here I am.
I heard you're also a runner.
I have been a runner, yes. I've run 3 marathons, a bunch of half marathons, and then the annual turkey trot is always a fun, exciting, and adventurous event in my family. I have 2 teenagers now, so it's harder. Yeah. When they were younger, we just dressed them as turkeys. And now there's a little bit of coercion involved with getting them to dress up in order to do the race. Yeah. But that is an annual event in the McKenna household.
All right. And you do have a really interesting background, because the things that you shared, the other things that have been shared with me, which is singing in Notre Dame's folk choir, being a soccer coach, vice president of boosters, Boy Scout. So talk to us just a little bit about how do all of those different things come together and really shape your approach to being a registrar, working in higher education, and going through all of the things that we're going through as an industry right now.
Yeah. How does it come together? It comes together naturally, I guess. These are just things that I do. I said we have 2 kids. I have a son who's now 18 and a daughter who's now 14. And as they were growing up, I wanted to be very involved with things that they were doing. And so I coached Little League soccer for both Drew and then for Ella, and did that for a couple of years before each of them were like, I'm not a soccer player anymore. And so I was like, all right, well, that was the thing we did. It was really fun getting to spend time with them in that way around their peeps. And I chaperone a lot of field trips as well for the same reason, where like I want to be involved, but I want them to do the things that they're going to do. And I get to observe them around their people and in sort of a natural environment. I think I mentioned recently that I learn all kinds of slang going on field trips with the middle school and now with the high school, and that I have never been called son more than on a field trip to an amusement park chaperoning a bunch of middle schoolers. So like these 9, 10, 11-year-olds be like, son, this is not a thing. So hilarious. Great times. We are a family who sings. Also, my dad sang in the West Point Glee Club and had performed on television as in the Glee Club. And that's actually, my dad met my mom through the West Point Glee Club. And so just growing up, we were a very musical family, and that has continued on through my own family. And before IBM, actually, after I graduated from Notre Dame, I played in a band, which made my parents super proud, I think. I was like, I finished at Notre Dame. I have a lot of debt. I'm going to go live with a bunch of guys and we're going to play in a band. I think that caused some heart palpitations, but they were very gracious about it. And so what led me to IBM originally was that I needed health insurance. So I took a job at IBM because I was like, who cares? They're going to pay me and give me health insurance. I can still do the band. And then our drummer got married and moved to California, and I was working for IBM, realized I liked it and was good at it,
Yeah.
and off and running. So yeah, all of the pieces just sort of come together and that's an approach that I like to take. Like an underlying philosophy is that like being present is really important. You have to show up to be there. And then while you're there, be there. And so when that happens, when you're able to do that and you're able to be in the moment, magical things happen. And it doesn't seem like an overwhelming amount of things while you're just like, let's do that thing and be in that thing. And so as a registrar, there are always so many things going on at the university. And so when you're doing something, you have to do that thing. And so being there, being present, and sort of imbuing that in your staff as well is a really important thing for me.
But I think it kind of speaks to a little bit of what we're going to get into today, right? Which is like you have all of these different pieces and parts that fit together that make up Doug. And all of those pieces and parts inform how you show up as a registrar. They inform how you've shown up as a student in your doctoral program. And it's that whole piece and looking at that whole piece that I think is a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, and a lot about what higher education and the workforce groups are talking about as well.
Yeah.
So let's switch a little bit and get into micro-credentials. The world of micro-credentials is expanding. A couple years ago, maybe a decade ago, there were a few providers. A recent tallies show that there's over 1 million different micro-credentials listed in all of these different registries. Some of them are verified, meaning that, the skills are verified and people know exactly what's being taught. Some are not. Approximately 20% are being delivered by higher education institutions, some of which can be articulated for credit, some can't. So when you think about all of that's going on, the short-term credentials, the fast pace that's going on outside of higher education for skills training, what considerations should registrars have, and how do they prioritize how they look at that learning?
These are conversations that Mason has been actively engaged in over the last several years. We have offered sort of continuing ed micro-credentials, so not for credit classes. These are workshops. These are, maybe there's a series of continuing ed classes that build up into a micro-credential, into a badge. The things that registrars need to think about when we talk about introducing a new kind of credential, and now it's not really that new. Micro-credentials have been around for a while, and they're starting to gain traction, both external from institutions, but also in an increasing number of higher education institutions. But they're going to be new to your institution at some point. And so when you introduce a new something, there's a lot of change management that goes on, even beyond just the standing up of the infrastructure to offer that something. So for micro-credentials, especially credit-bearing or micro-credentials that have parts of them included for credit, because that's another flavor, is part of the beauty of a micro-credential is that it's not locked into an accreditation model or framework yet, where they say it has to be this number and it has to be this type and these are the things that have to go into it. It's very open and free right now. And so one of the joys is the interdisciplinarity of it, the mix of experiential learning, non-credit learning, and for-credit classes. All of these things can be wrapped together to have someone earn a credential, a micro-credential, a badge. And so all of those things, the registrar's office has some input, control, or oversight with. We are generally involved, registrar's offices are generally involved in managing the curriculum approval process. And so if there are credit-bearing courses that are new, those are going to come through sort of established channels. If there are badges that are being proposed that are wholly constructed of credit-bearing classes or coursework, you need a process for those. It will look slightly different than the majors or a revision to a major or a new degree, but a lot of those steps are the same. And so you want the faculty to be involved. You want to get some sign off from the academic side of the house. So the faculty, the chairs, whoever is responsible for approving your curriculum at your institution. It can be chair level, council level, university-wide curriculum committees. It varies. But you want that because on the other side of things, you want to be able to attest externally that these things have value, that these have gone through the regular and appropriate oversight in order for an institution to stand behind it. And so registrars need to be active and engaged and involved in those conversations about who has to review this? How is this captured in the system? How are we tracking who is pursuing this badge or microcredential? And when do they earn it? And then who are the people who get to say this is awarded? And then how does it show up on the transcript, if at all? How are we, if someone comes back 3 years from now and says, I lost the certificate that I got when I finished this, whose responsibility is it at the institution to say, yep, here it is. Here's a copy of it, or here's verification for that. So all of those are sort of the logistical infrastructure questions that registrars' offices are generally involved with. And in my case, we manage most of those pieces at George Mason. So those are things that registrars should be cued into at this point with microcredentials. I would also say that AACRAO, the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers, say that 3 times fast, has some great resources about microcredentials. There's a microcredential community on the AACRAO exchange. So if you are a registrar or registrar adjacent and are interested in more resources about microcredentials, AACRAO is a great place to reach out to.
Yeah, and I know accreditation is specific to each accrediting body, but we get a lot of questions about, well, what are accreditors going to say?
Right.
So when you're looking at these different, whether it's a badge or it's a verified skill, how are you evaluating those through the lens of what the accreditor might be looking for?
We work closely with our liaisons. We have both SHEV, which is the State Council of Higher Education in Virginia, is the Virginia educational governing body. But then George Mason is accredited through SAC-COC, the Southern Association of something. And so we work closely with our liaison at George Mason, who is responsible for coordinating all of those things with the accrediting bodies and with our governing boards. And as a public institution, we have sort of that responsibility to the public to make sure that what we're doing stands up and will be useful. And so while the accrediting bodies and SHEV haven't issued formal guidelines yet about what a microcredential needs to be or look like, we are operating within a framework of other declarations that they've made. So graduate certificates are a minimum of 12 credits. Should we have microcredentials that overlap with graduate certificates? Right. Or can we build a different ecosystem within our offerings to say a microcredential is, for a graduate microcredential is limited to 11 credits. And then if it's beyond that, if you're proposing a micro-credential that is beyond 11 credits, that's really a graduate certificate. So right. Trying to keep things in appropriate lanes, swim lanes, for now, is a cautious approach that we're taking. That is not the approach that everyone takes. And some states do things differently with their oversight bodies. Mm-hmm. Private institutions are not subject to some of those same things. And until an accrediting body weighs in and says, this is what a micro-credential is, it's really sort of what can you offer and justify. Not like, it's not crazy. These are all like real things, because if it's not going to be useful. People aren't going to engage with it, and it'll wither on the vine. So you want to build something that is defensible from an oversight perspective, but also useful for a learner to come in and engage with, and to gather those skills, and be able to represent that in the marketplace of ideas and the literal marketplace of employment.
Right, right. And honestly, I mean, that's a great transition as we think about CLRs, comprehensive learner records, and LERs, two different things, although related. There's a lot going on in that right now. There's a lot of different places, organizations, and funders behind the concept of this wallet that students, employees can take with them from place to place.
Right.
So what's your perspective on CLRs and LERs?
I'm a little bit on the fringe here, and I think people may be surprised if they've heard me talk about technology. One of my sort of grounding things is that I want to intentionally, strategically, and consistently apply technology to administrative processes in order to make things more efficient, to make them more transparent, all of those things. That said, I'm reasonably skeptical of CLRs still. And I'll tell you why. It's about the data. Right now, higher education overall has real problems with our data, not with individual student data integrity,
Right.
but in sort of that umbrella. When you talk about the C of that is comprehensive. And if we're going to say this is the comprehensive learning that a student has received, but then the data only supports about a third of what we think they learn as part of their institutional experience, that's not a comprehensive learner record. And you're doing actually a disservice to the student to claim that it is, because when you say, here's your CLR, and it doesn't represent everything, as the institution who is claiming that comprehensiveness
Yes.
of that learning, like you have a responsibility then to be able to represent the clubs that they were involved in, the leadership positions that they had through those things, the service projects that they engaged with. And some institutions have tackled this. Elon has done this for many years because it's sort of baked into their institutional culture that their undergraduate students have a particular set of experiences. And so they've built structures and infrastructure to capture those and then to be able to represent those. Places like George Mason, we are a very large institution. We have students who do a variety of different things outside of the classroom. How do we represent the learning that those students are engaged in those experiences, and capture it and verify it and store it and maintain it and then represent it out on a document? It's very challenging. And part of that is because higher education also uses sort of a shotgun approach in terms of technology adoption. So we've got this behemoth enterprise resource planning system, an ERP. And it's the student information system, and then the finance side and the HR side. But then almost every other aspect of the student life is handled with other third-party vended technologies. So our Res Life system is not in the ERP, it's a separate thing. Our student engagement, separate thing. CVIS, separate thing. International student stuff. Our study abroad, our degree audit, all of these separate things. And so the challenge is not to say to a student, here's the comprehensive list of your learning. The challenge is wrangling all of those data elements into a meaningful way to provide some kind of a narrative for a student that these are the things that you engaged in, and this is how you can talk about them. Because that's really what the CLR helps to do. The academic transcript is all inside baseball. It was never really intended to be an external communicator. It was designed by registrars in the early 1900s as a way of saying, these are the classes and credits that a student took at my institution, and standardizing those formats so that when you handed off a transcript to another institution, they could parse out what the student had done. It was never intended to hand to an employer, make sense of this. We have 30 character section titles. Many of them are abbreviated. That's one of the fun jobs of being a registrar. You have to go through and make sure that none of those abbreviations turn out to be anything obscene. All those analytics classes, student analytics is a minefield when you start cutting down to 30 characters. Yeah. So that's just one part of the data challenges that we have. So I think a CLR is a good idea? Yes. Would it be beneficial to students? Absolutely. Can we crank out a CLR from any institution at any moment? No. And so the work really needs to be in integrating these systems, not in like constant communication kind of way, but in a gather the important data elements into a repository that we can then provide something meaningful as a CLR. So that's what I think.
Yeah. And where I get, because I agree, like philosophically, I'm on board. But even when we think about the inside baseball that you talked about, transcript to transcript, one institution to another institution, it's still interpreted differently.
Absolutely.
So do you see a day when a student can say, hi, institution B, I was at institution A, but I had to move into your state, and now I want to come to your school, and here's my CLR, and that institution will more easily be able to transfer that student in or understand what all of that means and make, right? Because if you go from a residential school like yours, where you're learning things from the student activities and all of the things that you're talking about, right? The life experience that they're gaining, right. And then go to a fully online institution that maybe doesn't have that same experience, how those experiences transfer in for credit would be very different, I'm guessing.
Absolutely. And I think this gets to really sort of the heart of the matter of how challenging prior learning assessment and awarding credit for prior learning is, because I don't see a day when that happens. American higher education has grown up with a real sense of faculty independence, and in all the best ways. This is not a knock on faculty. And so every institution has its own culture. It has its own faculty who have their own areas of focus and opinions, even in something as simple and straightforward as math. Like when you say, I took math 103 at this school, what is it at your school? Mm-hmm. Faculty often want to see a syllabus. What concepts were taught? How was it assessed? Those types of things. And so in a similar way, the challenge of gathering those data initially in order to provide a CLR, the infrastructure on the other side also needs to be there to interpret and assess that CLR. I don't see the CLR taking the place of the academic transcript. I think we need to revise and update the academic transcript, but I don't see the CLR as replacing it from institution to institution or from institution to admissions office. Right. I think the CLR is a tool for individual students to use as they pursue employment opportunities or opportunities external to higher education, however broadly you want to define those. There is a deeply held belief in faculty independence and in academic freedom in American higher education, which we desperately want to defend and maintain. That said, it's also kind of a pain when you're like, this is math 101 over here, it's math 101 over here. They have the same list of topics in the course description. Why aren't they the same? Why can't the student have credit for what they did over there, over here, and move them along in the process? It's because the faculty who designed the course over here weren't the faculty who designed the course over there, and they want to be able to make those determinations for themselves.
Yeah. And you kind of hit on PLA just a second ago, and as you know, PLA is near and dear to our hearts. Do you think we're ever going to figure it out?
Yes, I think we are, and I'll tell you why. I think we have to. And let me talk more about transfer credit, because that is a more established process. There's, I think, a better understanding of transfer. And I think the way that PLA will work at institutions is by modeling the assessment process on the way that transfer credit evaluation has been done. So, transfer, you have a student goes to another institution or many institutions, and they provide the transcripts to the receiving institution. At George Mason, there is a team of transfer admissions. They receive those, they review what coursework at that institution, they enter all that into the system. If an evaluation has been done for any of those courses in the last X number of years, I think it's 5 years, some of them are a more frequent recurrence. So STEM courses have a more frequent reevaluation timeframe. Literature, less so, because Shakespeare is still Shakespeare, but computer science is moving on. So if an evaluation has been done for any of those courses at that institution, those just get awarded. It's where an evaluation hasn't been done or an equivalency hasn't been established, that then it enters a process where it goes out to the faculty member in the appropriate department to say, what is this? And oftentimes they will look at the course description and be able to say, yeah, this is this. Sometimes if they're not able to make that determination from the course description, they will ask for a course syllabus. More in detail. What did they read? What were the assignments? Those types of things. And then that evaluation is done and it's entered in the system. Next student has that class from that institution, automatically gets that equivalency. Where PLA hits a snag is that it's very unlikely that two individuals who are requesting their prior learning be assessed are going to have exactly the same thing from exactly the same place. And so the level of complexity involved is increased when you start bringing in non-course, experiential learning, employment experiences, those types of things. And it's also not 100% clear all the time which department should review and evaluate what that prior learning means and how to provide credit to that student for those experiences. And so those are complications within the PLA process, prior learning assessment process, that then, hits a snag where the credit being awarded either takes longer, or oftentimes faculty will say, well, this isn't comparable to any courses that we teach. And that's probably true. So how are we capturing and representing and crediting that experience? Does it come in as a general credit? Does it come in as a subject specific but general non-course credit? And then additional questions flow from that, because the degree audits for students are built based on what's approved in the course catalog. And so I've said course now multiple times, and that's predicated in our assumptions about how students will pursue and progress through their academic career. They will take a series of courses and meet these requirements. So PLA throws a bug in that, a wrench in the works. And so when you load in subject matter general credit or just overall general credit, then there's an additional step to show the student, okay, here's where these credits apply
Right.
in the degree audit. And so there are a couple of steps beyond just transfer equivalencies, transfer evaluation that make PLA more challenging. But that same structure, that same framework can be applied for PLA and can be leveraged at scale for PLA once you stand it up and communicate to people about what it is they're trying to do, what it is we as an institution are trying to do, and why.
I think one of the fascinating things that I've learned since working in this space a little bit more specifically is I always knew we were all different. Always knew that. Every institution has its own mission. We all have different faculty. We have different accreditors. We have different student bodies. But knowing now, it's just fascinating when you see there are certain states that are going as far as legislating that if prior learning experience, let's just stick with like the portfolio concept and not worry necessarily about credentials and all of the other things that are a little bit easier to analyze. But this person's 20 years of work experience has been evaluated and validated towards credit at an institution. Taking that and transferring that to another institution, because it's been such a challenge, we're starting to see states legislate that. And there's this part of me that is like, yes, right? If it counted here, it has to count there. But the challenge is exactly what you're talking about, which is, but are they in the same degree? Do they have the same course catalog? For all of the reasons that we're all so different, which gives students lots of different choices.
Yeah.
Right? It's those differences that also make going from an institution that might have been very PLA or CPL friendly, and then you go to another institution that may have a different accreditor that says, well, we can put those all in your gen ed bucket, but they can't actually count towards your degree requirements, your topic degree requirements. I mean, do you see that the same way, or do you think there's a path forward in that?
I think that there are some nudges that will likely be needed for institutions to really engage with this as a systemic addressing of the issue. When I was at Michigan State, Michigan signed a transfer agreement in state. And so all the schools had to provide their first 2 years course offerings, 100, 200 level courses. And huge effort. Michigan State actually hosted the transfer equivalency exchange. And so all of that was built out in order to streamline mobility between institutions in the state. Again, like the complexity of assessing someone's prior learning is that it's unlikely that two people will have exactly the same experiences. And so you're not able to build that same model of everybody throw all of your coursework here. And once we establish these equivalencies, that's what it is. And they're, updated on a regular basis, whatever time limit that is. For PLA, it's going to take a commitment to do the kind of assessment and interrogation of learning that will enable positive outcomes for students, that will enable the transfer of credit, that will enable the awarding of credit, of degree applicable credit. And I think that we're in a weird place right now with higher education, not just nationally, politically, but in a demographic sense, where we have fewer students graduating from high school now, and there is a demographic decline of students coming. People have referred to it as the enrollment cliff. At the same time, we have some 40 million students 40 million learners who have some college credit but no degree.
Right.
Those two things don't have to be the end of higher education in the United States. There will be a bunch of schools that wind up closing because they are not able to meet their enrollment needs, because there are fewer students to draw from in order to pull into their institutions. And George Mason is not one of those institutions. We have 40,000 students. We're a public institution. We're talking about institutions that are on the smaller side, maybe private, maybe small liberal arts institutions. Prior learning assessment is an opportunity for those institutions to engage with a group of learners who want to come back, who want to finish, but haven't been able to. And so the outreach that they need to do, it needs to be targeted to those 40 million Americans who started college, didn't graduate, have some college credit. What does that look like? I don't know that we're going to get, how do I say this nicely? I don't think we're going to get positive political mandates from the federal government about supporting higher education in that way. I think that we will see instead consortia of schools coming together to say, this is what we're working on. These are the people we're targeting. We need to partner in ways that we never have before. You know, tying all of the lifeboats together makes a bigger floating object than just one lifeboat over here and one lifeboat over there. And so as schools realize what they're up against in terms of enrollments, I think that there will be a push either from smaller groups of institutions individually or from states who recognize that their institutions are at risk, and want to take some some proactive measures. And prior learning is one of those ways that I think is low-hanging fruit in this. It's not easy. I don't want to imply that, but a commitment to it can make it more streamlined. It can make it easier for the students and for the institutions if you build a good process. And so that's, I think, one of the outcomes that we will likely see over the next 5 years is increasing numbers of schools engaging in outreach to students who have some credit, no degree, and as an incentive for them, engaging more deeply, more seriously in prior learning assessment.
Yeah, and I think you really hit the piece about the process, and I think the defendable, I'm going to use another made-up word today, the defendableness, the defensibility of that process, and breaking maybe a little bit of urban legend that PLA is just checking a box for experience, when in fact prior learning assessment in of itself is hopefully becomes a little bit more standardized, but a standardized approach to assessing their experience, but then having them validate that learning, right? It's not just experience for credit. It is, what did you learn from that experience? And I think the more we can kind of scale that approach, because it is a manual approach right now, we'll be able to gain some momentum there. All right, so I know we're getting close on time. If you were king for the day, what are 3 things that you would mandate to improve prior learning assessment?
Oh, I've wanted to be king for a day for a long time. So if I were king for a day and wanted to improve prior learning assessment, I think that I would get buy-in from provosts and deans and chairs of departments. I think that the top-down leadership in encouraging faculty to engage in this process is critical. Faculty are taxed. They are overworked. They are stretched. Their teaching loads have increased. Their responsibility to publish and continue doing research. All of those things are front and center in a faculty member's mind. And anything that takes them away from that, rightly or wrongly, is viewed sort of with some suspect. And so they need to know that this is an important thing for the institution, and they need to hear that communicated from provosts, from their deans, from the chairs. And then all of those people need to recognize what kind of labor is involved in this. It can't just be something that is tacked on to all of the other work that a faculty member does. I think wherever we can provide, the imperial we, because I'm the king for the day, wherever we can provide either stipends, probably not course releases, but other incentives for faculty, individual faculty and departments to engage in this process would be really helpful. And so, getting that buy-in from the top, providing some incentive to individual faculty members, those are two things. And the third thing, I think, is one thing that you have already started working on and may be able to provide, and that is a more streamlined flow for the student to be able to provide evidence of their learning and to create that sort of central repository for an individual to say, these are the things I've done. This is what I did at IBM. These are the classes that they sent me to at IBM. I don't have any other thing. I built 3 databases for them and they gave me an award and sent me to Palm Springs. That's true. But I don't have any, I didn't get any credit anywhere for that. And so here are the things that I did. And how would you like me to explain what that meant for me and what I learned in that process? Like being able to have something more than, a Word document or, a SharePoint folder on my own personal site.
Yeah.
Being able to present that into an institution and have the institution be able to track where that is, who's reviewed it, what they said about it, what credit is being considered, what credit has been awarded. All of those pieces, the administrative pieces, really need some love in terms of process, because a lot of it's going to come back to staff on the registrar's office as well, or the transfer admissions team. And those groups also super overworked. This is another process that we will support, and we need to make it as high quality and efficient and reliant on technology as possible, because we're not getting more staff really. Right. And so we need to be more efficient and more effective in the tools that we use and the processes that we employ. Okay. So those are my 3 things.
Great. I'm going to circle back a little bit to what we were talking about in the beginning, which was micro-credentials and all of the different ways students learn and what they learn. And there's a lot going on right now with durable skills and competencies. And then on the academic side, we have course descriptions and hopefully course outcomes. What are your thoughts on there ever being an alignment between academic definitions of learning and how that translates to workforce skills, durable skills, all of the skills that we're reading a lot about right now?
Yeah, I think that as there's increasing awareness in higher education of ways that we can communicate those things externally, there is an increasing awareness of the need to both capture, track, and then be able to represent those things. The first step is working with your registrar's office, because as I said before, we're largely responsible for managing sort of the curriculum approval process or the curriculum management broadly at an institution. Whenever a new course is created, if you're an accredited institution, you have to demonstrate and list out sort of what the learning objectives are for that course. Same with if you're offering a new major or revising your major, your accreditors are going to want to know, what is it that the student can do, or what do you expect the student to be able to do at the outcome, at the end of this? What are the outcomes from this? And so all of that is entered into the system. And it's, again, not surfaced in meaningful ways consistently from institution to institution. And so I think an increased awareness, an increased emphasis on how important those things are, and the value that the registrar's office can provide if we are able to meaningfully assign. These are the courses that this student took. Look at all the combination of learning outcomes, and look at all the, there are 13 critical thinking skills as listed as learning outcomes in the 35 courses this student took. That's amazing. We ought to be able to represent that somehow, somewhere. And whether that's a micro-credential that they earn automatically just through the combination of those courses, or whether it's an addition on the CLR. These are things that institutions have to be more strategic about: the data that they collect, where they store it, and then how they use it. They have to leverage it in benefit, to the benefit of the student and the learner. All of that comes back as a positive to the institution. Like, if we're able to do that and our students are able to differentiate themselves in the marketplace, they get employed. That goes back into our, what percentage of your students within 6 months of graduation have a job. That goes into, the U.S. News and World Report rankings. So this should be a positive feedback loop. But again, it starts with the data. And how is that entered? Who's tracking it? Is it standardized? And can it be used in meaningful ways? Can we pull a report and say, these are the courses the student took, these are all the learning outcomes associated with those courses? That's where registrars come in.
They are the backbone. Really are. So you're kind of touching on it, and I think you've touched on it in some other things that you've done recently, but we're kind of touched on the perception of the value of the degree a little bit, right? And are they workforce ready? All of those things. So if we flip the script just a little bit, what data strategies should institutions use so that we can effectively demonstrate outcomes and continuous improvement? Like, is it time for us to argue back and say there is value in the degree and here's why? And if so, what data should we be using to do that with?
There's already data that shows there's value in the degree. Consistently, studies, lifetime earnings, all of those studies point to an increase in life expectancy, an increase in over lifetime earning potential. All of those things represent a positive value to a degree from a higher education institution. We can and should be doing a better job using our data, leveraging the data to make that argument. And it's very similar to what I was just talking about with the learning objectives and being able to represent those. One of the problems that we have is that we have such institutions push students through in 15 credit increments, in chunks. And for the semester at a time, the student may be taking 5 different subjects. Each semester is a different set of courses, somewhat related to what they've taken before, maybe. There are obviously sequences of courses that they take, that they work through in particular majors. But otherwise, it's a very scattershot approach in higher education. And ultimately, did they get to their 120 credits? Did they fulfill their general education requirements, their college requirements, and their major requirements? Did they double major? Did they get a minor? Did they do a certificate? Like all those things, it's very sort of disaggregated almost in a student's experience. And so one of the challenges is helping the student communicate what their learning arc was. What was their story as they traveled through those little pieces and pieces? It's very stressful for students, higher education, and every final exam is very stressful. And so it's difficult for students to think, I just got to get through the finals for these 5 classes. I got to make it to my second semester freshman year. I got to come back for sophomore year. Like there's a nose to the grindstone kind of approach from the student to, churn, get through. Higher education is failing our students in that way because the way that they get jobs, the way that they are successful in their life is to be reflective about that experience overall. And it's not just what they learn in their classes. It's, oh, and I lived with so-and-so this year, and that was a real challenge. And I had to, I wound up mediating a bunch of conflicts between this suite mate and that suite mate. That's a learning experience. I was an RA at this point. I had to, do all the things that RAs do and dealt with, people losing parents, people breaking up, people failing classes. Like, that's real life. That's a learning experience. Capturing that and creating that narrative for students, encouraging them to create that narrative in a reflexive way, an intentional way, is something we largely don't do as institutions. Because we've got, they made their 120, they did their major requirements, they did their gen eds. So that's one thing fourth thing, if I could change as the king, would be some kind of ongoing reflective praxis so that students could say, these are the experiences I had this semester. This is how it has affected me as a person. You write that 8 times at the end of your college career, you have a story and you are better able to say, that was a really important experience for me. That study abroad experience changed my life. That class, I wouldn't take it again. Honestly, because they're not all winners, and that's really,
But what you learn from that is to stick with it. Right.
Exactly.
So there's still, even in the non-winning ones, there's a lesson there that you have to finish what you start, because that is what will be expected once you're in the workforce.
Exactly.
Even if you don't like it.
So building that in, I think, is one of those things that, again, higher education is going to struggle with, because it's a very conservative enterprise, right? Not in a political sense, but in a retain the status quo sense.
Yes, very much.
We are largely structured the way that we were in the mid 1800s. And we are there are still instructional methods that are used from, the early 1900s. So pulling people along into a change, and it's not really even a change, it's more of an intentionality about the way that we impart and create knowledge. And the world is changing. And it's changing fast. And institutions need to do something in order to keep up. And I think that this is an easy way to build in some of that benefit for their students as they go out into the world.
Great. I think we could talk all day.
I could.
I don't think anybody's going to listen to us all day, though. So, Doug, thank you so much for joining me and for having this conversation. I appreciate the input. I think, if nothing else, just talking about this and getting these ideas in front of people is going to make a huge difference. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun. And again, I could talk about it for a long time. So whenever you need.
Absolutely. Thank you.